Hi, and welcome to the Caterpillar Cross Stitch YouTube channel. My name's Ford from Son of a Stitch, and this week I want to talk to you about knots, so let's get knotty. Now, knots have been the bane of the existence of fiber artists since time immemorial, and cross-stitching is no different. But most of the time, the knots that we get with cross-stitching are not a true knot. They're more of a slip knot or a hitch, so they can usually be undone pretty easily. To show you what I'm talking about, I'm going to enlist the help of our old friend Scrappy here, and I'm going to do a little bit of stitching until a knot appears, and I'll show you how they can usually be dealt with. Because we're talking about knots today, I'm going to start my thread here using the waist knot method, where you tie a knot close to the end of your thread, then you pull it through, you move a little way along the surface of the fabric, and then you stitch back towards your thread. Then your stitches will be, or you stitch back towards your knot. Then your stitches will be binding up that thread on the back, and you'll be able to just snip that knot off when you reach it. So now I've caught back up to my knot here, so I can easily just pull on my tail a little bit, give it a snip, and then when I push my stitch back down through, it'll pull that tiny bit of tail that's left there. This is a great easy way to start a thread, especially if you're using a stand or a scroll stand or something like that you can't easily turn your project over. So now I'm just going to go ahead and stitch until I get a knot, and then we'll talk again. I want to take just a second here to remind you to join the Caterpillar Cross Stitch VIP Stitch Club. When you join, you'll get a digital download of our top 10 cross-stitching tips. You'll get a free ebook with 8 free PDF cross-stitch patterns in it, and you'll get all the latest news and updates, including advance notice about any future stitch-alongs or stitch retreats that Caterpillar throws. So hit the link down there in the description so that you don't miss any of those great perks. All right, so it took me about 40 stitches before I encountered a knot, and that's stitching carelessly without any of the preventative measures that I'm going to teach you about in just a bit. So let's take a look at what I've got here. You can see I've got this little loop here on the back. Most of the time, that's what the knot that you get in cross-stitching is going to look like. But they're actually, most of the time, very easy to fix. All you really need to do is take your needle, stick it in that loop, and pull it back against the stitching. And just kind of rock it back and forth, because it's really a slip knot. So if you can pull it up to the end where it's just at a crease, it will then just pop out. Now, the most common knot in stitching, that's how it happens, and that's how you deal with it. It's really, really simple. If you tug on it too hard, then you're going to lock it down and it's going to be a lot harder to remove. But most of the time, that's all it takes. Now, that's a lot easier to do if you're using the kind of project that you can easily turn it over. If you're on a stand or scroll stand or something like that, then that's a lot harder to do. So it's a lot easier and saves you some time and some heartache if you can prevent them from happening to begin with. So I'm going to teach you my favorite tips for making sure that you don't get those little knots to begin with. The number one is a technique I've talked about before. I call it the one-stroke method. The reason I like to stitch this way, one of the many reasons I like to stitch this way, is because it keeps the thread on top of the piece at all times, so I can see if a knot's about to form and stop pulling. So all I do really for that is I pass my needle with the thread on it down through the surface of the fabric and only pull enough through to be able to turn my needle back around. And then I pull all of the floss through with it on top of the fabric. That way I can see if it gets tangled up or a knot is about to form. This also, for me, helps me maintain a more consistent tension on my stitches because it holds some tension on the last stitch that I did and gives me an even more tidy stitch in my experience. Another technique that a lot of people use in order to prevent tangles and binds is to use a thread conditioner of some kind. Beeswax is a very popular choice for this, and you can just use really any old solid beeswax for that. There are things that are sold specifically for that purpose. They have cool little plastic cases with slits in them and stuff so you can pull the thread through. Those help reduce static electricity on the thread, which reduces its tendency to stick to itself and therefore reduces its likelihood of binding up into one of those knots. Another really great thread conditioner that you can use that's really inexpensive is malleable silicone. You can buy this at most grocery stores or pharmacies, sold as earplugs. There was, in fact, an extremely popular thread conditioner product on the market that went out of business, and when they did, they told people, you can just go buy silicone earplugs. It's the exact same thing that we were using. So you can get those silicone earplugs and you can just kind of hold it against your thread and run it across it. Again, that'll make it a little more slide prone so that it won't bind against itself, and it'll reduce the buildup of static electricity. Now I realized the need for this video when I saw a thread online with someone asking for help on a project that was being plagued by knots. And it can be tremendously valuable to be a member of a cross-stitch community. There is so much knowledge available in, say, a group like the Caterpillar Cross-Stitch Facebook group, or in the comments thread of the Caterpillar Cross-Stitch Instagram. So hit those two communities, and when you have questions in future, you can tap that enormous hive mind of other Caterpillar Cross-Stitch fans, and it can be really up your game when it comes to cross-stitching. So check those out. Now, one thing that I really like to do in order to help prevent tangles is to straighten my thread out just a little bit before I start. Because I use floss bobbins, my thread tends to have these little kinks in it where it is folded around the bobbin. And this is especially true when I start to get towards the end of a skein where it's folded more tightly around the bobbin. So I like to try to mitigate those, and really all I do is I take my thread after I've cut it and before I've separated the strand, and I stretch it out. If I'm using a long piece, I'll fold it in half first. And I will just hold that against my lips. And blow through it. The steam and the warmth from my breath will mitigate the severity of those kinks and will reduce the likelihood of my floss tangling with itself. Now, another preventative measure that I recommend is to use a larger needle. I know I harp on this all the time, but the number one mistake that people use in cross-stitching is using too small of a needle, because they are worried that the larger needle will stretch the holes in the fabric out and that then the project won't look quite so tidy. But your fabric is usually cotton. It's a very malleable and forgiving fabric. You want to stretch those holes out just a little bit so that the thread can pull through. If you're using too small of a needle, when you go to pull your thread through, you're going to hear just a little bit of a pop when it gets to the eye of the needle. That's because there's friction building up against the floss itself, which means when you pull the floss through, you have to break through that tension barrier and you get a little bit of a If you're getting a really grating, grinding noise as you pull your floss through, that's also because there's a lot of friction going on. That friction creates static electricity, makes the thread bind to itself, and makes it create knots. It also wears out your floss, so it will look more and more fuzzy as you get towards the end of a particular piece. So that'll create an inconsistent look in your project. So using a slightly larger needle can really help. Now, I made a video about selecting the right size needle recently that will give you some rules of thumb. So go and check that one out. But those are always rules of thumb. If you're getting a pop, if you're getting a really grindy noise, use a slightly larger needle and you'll find a much better experience. Don't worry about it stretching the hole out in the fabric a little bit, especially when you wash it at the end. That's going to close back up and it will be fine. Another one of the things that I do that helps prevent tangles and knots is using loop start. Your floss has a nap, that is a direction of twist. The floss consists of millions of individual little tiny fibers that have been twisted together to make the floss. That twist has a direction. So if you're using two pieces of floss from the same cut, then those have the same direction of twist. So again, as you pull it through, that direction of twist builds up, and then you get the floss tangling up, and that creates the opportunity for knots to happen. If you're using both ends of a single piece of floss, which is what you do with loop start, the twist of those two pieces opposes one another. So the twist that creates of the friction on the fabric gets canceled out. So the floss will be less likely to tangle up. Now, with experience, you eventually learn to feel when a knot happens, because it doesn't quite seat right against the fabric. So if it's on the back where you can't see it, you'll feel that the tension is wrong. But occasionally it happens that you have a knot in your stitching that you didn't notice until much, much later. Now, people who are really fastidious about it will either go back to that point or go cut that out, replace the stitches. Personally, it depends on how serious I am about the project, but sometimes I like to have a more lazy method of fixing that problem. So what I do when that happens, like if you look here, I've got a knot here that happened a little while ago. So what I'll usually do is I'll stitch a ways away from it. So I'm going to stitch down to the end of this row here, and that should be about the right distance for me on this one, I think. Okay, there we go. So I've stitched a little bit away from it, and all I'm really going to do is I'm going to stick my floss through that loop, and I'm going to just do another stitch. It's lazy, it's messy, it doesn't leave the back of the project looking amazing. So if you're stitching for a competition or something like that, obviously you don't want to do this, but you can just pull that knot tight so that you don't have that loose floss back there risking getting snagged and getting in the way of your other stitches, and then just stitch over the top of it. No one has to know but you. So like, it's not pretty, but it saved me 20 minutes of annoying work of going back and fixing that knot. So I'm just gonna leave it in there, pull it tight, stitch over the top of it. And then nobody but you has to know that that knot was ever even there. So what about you? Is there something specific that you do in order to avoid knots or to deal with them when they happen? Leave it in the comments down below, and maybe you'll change the life of one of the other viewers. While you're down there, why don't you give the video a like and subscribe to the channel, because that's how my performance is tracked, and I would really appreciate it if you did. I want to thank you so much for watching. For Caterpillar Cross Stitch, my name is Ford, and I will see you next time.